Welcome to Better Than Before. This series is a collaboration with Canary, the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, with funding from the Open Society Foundations. We are exploring how to build back better from the COVID-19 pandemic, supporting the Caribbean's transition to socially inclusive, climate resilient, and environmentally sustainable development. I am your host, Dirval Bazi, founder of the Climate Conscious podcast. Today's special guest is presently a professor of economics and a deputy principal at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. Since joining the university, he has also been the head of the Department of Economics and the director of the School for Graduate Studies and Research. He is a very active public commentator on issues related to national development and is a former president of the Barbados Economics Society. His recent research has examined the issues surrounding the green economy, private sector development, as well as the economic impact of climate change on tourism. He has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, books, and book chapters. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Surrey, an MSc in economics from the University of Warwick, and a BSc in economics from the University of West Indies, Cave Hill. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Winston Moore.
Thank you very much.
So it seems like the world is facing crisis on top of crisis. Energy prices, climate change, biodiversity loss, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. About 3 years ago, life as we knew it changed dramatically. So much so that instead of returning to normal, the conversation became about the new normal. So today we're discussing COVID-19 recovery and green jobs and economic development. And one might be tempted to ask, what does a global health crisis have to do with the just transition of the workforce? But the pandemic showed us just how connected everything is. People, systems, economies, it's all connected. Now, according to a study by Ram et al., published in 2018, a major development challenge in the Caribbean is slow economic growth due to natural resource dependent economies. Our economies depend on things like tourism, agriculture, fishing, mining, oil and gas in some cases. And also, we have limited economic diversification. So these pre-existing conditions were amplified by the pandemic and are reflected in decline in the GDP, increased unemployment, and increased public debt in the Caribbean. So as the region pursues economic recovery, it is clear that the old models of development no longer serve us. And the concept of building back better has now become the goal. So building back better is about making sure that investments in post-COVID recovery are aligned with sustainable development. So Professor Moore, I'd like to start off by first having you define what the concept of sustainable development means to you.
Well, you started with one of the hardest questions. Sustainable development, there's so many papers written on this issue. And my perspective, however, is that it largely relates to having zero or limited impact on the environment while still providing opportunities for growth and development. A lot of studies do not really emphasize the growth component, but economic growth is so important in relation to Caribbean economies. Growth generates jobs. It addresses the issue in relation to poverty that we face in the Caribbean. You mentioned jobs a little bit earlier. Many countries in the Eastern Caribbean, for example, have rates of unemployment of around 20 to 40%, which is a large proportion of your labor force not being utilized. Then if you look at the rates of poverty as well, rates of poverty of 20 to 30%, even for example, here in Barbados, which is considered a highly developed country, We have rates of poverty of around 15%. So poverty is definitely not an issue that we've resolved as yet in the Caribbean. And growth is one of those ways that we can resolve those issues in relation to unemployment and poverty. But we have to have growth that does not impact on the environment. Because once you use up your natural resources, those natural resources, very hard to recover those natural resources. If you think, just for example, our coral reefs are a key part of our tourism industry. They lead to our sandy white shores, they lead to a bountiful fish. But as a result of the warming seas, a lot of our coral reefs are going to be destroyed over the next 30 to 50 years. It will have an impact on Caribbean life, the way in which we do business in the Caribbean and our lifestyles. But it's an issue that unfortunately isn't being discussed as much as it should be discussed, because once our coral reefs are impacted in a significant way, it will fundamentally change Caribbean economies going forward in the future. So to me, sustainable development is all about ensuring growth and opportunities while still minimizing the impact on the environment.
Now, you mentioned, I would say, two key priorities: the environment and natural resources, but also growth and opportunities. And when you mentioned the issue of coral reefs, it reminded me of this vicious cycle where we utilize natural resources for growth, but then the growth impacts negatively on those same natural resources that we rely on. And we're kind of caught in this cycle. So, with that in mind, what are some of the pathways that would allow us to achieve sustainable development for future generations, even for the present generation?
Well, there's one area that most of my research is focused on in the last maybe 10 years or so, and that's in the area of the green economy. Green growth or the green economy essentially means you're trying to develop those areas of the economy that generate economic activity while still minimizing the impact on the environment. I'll give you an example from Barbados, where of an industry that has been growing very quickly in recent times, but it has also helped us to minimize our environmental footprint. And that is in the area of solar water heaters. Traditionally, in most countries, the way in which we generate hot water is that we utilize electricity, and electricity more often than not is generated from some type of fossil fuel. And using that electricity, we then warm the water to provide water for showers or for cooking or whatever the case may be. So there's an environmental footprint in relation to a nice warm bath on the morning. But if you can utilize solar water heaters, which use the sun to generate warm water, then that reduces the environmental footprint of households, of businesses, of tourism entities. And it's a fundamental game changer in relation to doing business and our lifestyles in smaller and developing states. Now, building on that, our really great history in relation to solar water heaters. In recent times, we've also gotten into the realm of using solar energy to produce electricity. So now on a lot of Barbadian rooftops, you're going to see a solar water heater, but you're also going to see photovoltaic cells as well. And most households are selling, well, a lot of households are selling electricity to the grid that they would have generated from their photovoltaic systems. And as a result of the installation of these systems, you've seen the demand for fossil fuels fall in Barbados from the utility. So the utility doesn't need to generate as much electricity from fossil fuels because households and businesses are generating that same electricity from the sun's rays. So you're still generating economic activity, you're still supporting economic activity because someone needs to construct those solar water heaters, because we do the assembly here in Barbados. Someone needs to install the solar water heaters as well as install the photovoltaic systems. So you're creating jobs as well, but you are reducing the utilization of fossil fuels in the economy. So those types of really nice linkages between economic activity And reducing our environmental footprint is what the green economy is about as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to do just with fossil fuels. The way in which we manage our waste, for example, is part of the green economy. So rather than utilizing lots of packaging in relation to goods and services, we can utilize more green packaging or reduce the amount of packaging that we use. So the amount of waste that goes into the landfill is then reduced as well. We can also employ various recycling mechanisms as well. So in Barbados, we have this bottle return mechanism where rather than dumping your plastic bottle from your soda, which you shouldn't be drinking anyway because it leads to a number of NCDs, you can return your bottles to various bottle depots around the island and you get some cash as a result. This has a number of potential benefits. It has become a source of income for many low income individuals. And it also prevents waste, these plastic bottles ending up in gutters around the country, ending up, in on the highways or on the roads and so on, so that all of the bottles are collected and we can then ship those to recycling centers around the island as well. So that is essentially what the green economy is about, generating growth and jobs while minimizing the economic impact.
It also segues well into our discussion around building back better as governments invest in COVID-19 recovery stimulus packages. It's not just about the economic impact. As we've seen, everything is connected. And the issues that were there prior to the pandemic, they still exist. And in many cases, they are even more what should I say, even more aggressive in terms of their effects on the population. But from your perspective of higher education, in what ways did you see COVID-19 affecting or negatively impacting sustainable development in the Caribbean?
So focusing particularly on higher education, there were positives as well as negatives. I'll start first with the negatives, unfortunately. The main impact has been on affordability. Affordability both at the micro and macro level. A number of students have delayed or postponed their studies at the undergraduate level, at the master's level, simply because they can't afford it. They don't have the funds to pursue higher education at this point in time. And unfortunately, it's actually the best time to pursue higher education because when you are in a recession, there are very few jobs available on the market. So what you want to do is retool. You want to acquire the skills that would help you to find a job when the economy recovers. So it's a little bit of a paradox because you can't afford to come to university, but it is actually the best time to come to university when you're in a recession. In addition to that micro perspective, there's also the macro perspective as well, where a number of Caribbean governments have not been able to support their students to pursue higher education. And I'm using higher education very broadly now because it's not just university level, but you can also pursue higher education at the community college level, and also technical and vocational educational training is also an important part of providing skills for our citizens in the Caribbean. But because the COVID-19 pandemic has essentially reduced economic activity to a halt, it had a significant impact on the ability of governments to collect tax revenues. And as tax revenues fall, then governments had no choice but to cut expenditure. And expenditure cuts have taken place in many areas, and unfortunately, one of those areas was education. So that's the negative side. Let me look at the positive side and some of the things that we're doing here at the KFIL campus and at UWI in general to help transform Caribbean economies. One of the things that we had to do during the COVID-19 pandemic is that we had to engage in what we call emergency remote online teaching. So economies were closed, individuals could not leave their homes, but we still needed to teach our students. So we moved that classroom, that face-to-face instruction from the classroom, and we moved that to the online classroom. And we did that in a very short period of time. Most other universities around the world essentially shut down for a year because of the COVID-19 pandemic. The UWI, all of the campuses, K-Phil, Mona, St. Augustine, Five Islands, the open campus, we still continued during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we continued using online education. And that allowed many students to continue their education, even though the economies were essentially shut down. So at graduation, we had a number of students who would have been, we call them the COVID students, because not only they had to live through this COVID-19 pandemic, but they had to live through studies which were largely online for the last 2 years. And they probably would have had just 1 year of face-to-face instruction. But these students, despite it all, they would have worked as hard as possible to make sure that they graduated with a quality university education. The second thing that we did in recent times is that we've developed shorter courses. We find individuals, not only younger individuals, but older individuals are not as interested in pursuing that, a longer term degree, like a 3 4 year degree, but they're interested in acquiring skills. So if I'm an economist, this is what I know best. Maybe I might not want to do a full economics degree, but I might want to learn about economic statistics. So we would offer a course in economic statistics. So in terms of developing and reorienting the university, we've gone into a lot more short courses as well to provide citizens in the Caribbean the opportunities to acquire the skills that they want, and then hopefully encourage them to pursue a university degree a little bit later on. The third thing that we've done as well is the type of degrees that we've been offering. We've been offering degrees in areas that are directly targeted to sustainable development. Not just because we are interested in this area, but it's because we see this as a fundamental part of our role as a public university in the Caribbean that has been struggling with growth and has been struggling with the issue of sustainable development. So we've developed new degrees in business analytics. We've developed new degrees in nutrition and dietetics, which addresses that issue that I touched on earlier in relation to NCDs. And also our traditional degrees in the area of environmental and resource management as well have continued to be very popular. So we have been developing degrees to essentially address these resource challenges. And then I'm going to add on one more that I forgot to mention. Remember I told you about our emergency remote online teaching. Just because we can see the tail end of COVID-19, we haven't simply thrown out all of the lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of teaching online. We actually are now incorporating those skills that we acquired through the emergency remote online teaching and providing students the opportunity to not only get face-to-face instruction, but also benefit from, a sprinkling of online education as well. And the students enjoy the online education and the flexibility that it brings, but they also enjoy being in the classroom and interacting with their lecturers and other students as well. So we're trying to have the best of both worlds and marrying those two things together.
Well, thank you for sharing the impact of COVID-19 from a higher education perspective and for also giving us both sides of the story in terms of the positive and negative impacts. As we know, with any crisis, there are opportunities. But just for everyone's benefit, when we talk about the just transition of the workforce, what do we mean by this?
Really great question. I'll try to break this down into two components. Now, climate change, as we know, will have a significant impact on Caribbean economies. Sea level rise, higher temperatures. I think we've seen for the last couple of years more extremes in terms of weather. So you have more floods and also more droughts, and then more extreme hurricanes as well. And that's what the science points to, that you get more extremes as a result of climate change. Now, the response to climate change is one of two things. You can either mitigate or you can adapt. Ideally, you should do both. We want a lot of our more developed countries to do a lot more mitigation because they're the ones that have been basically responsible for most of the carbon emissions. And countries within the Caribbean are very minuscule contributors to global carbon emissions. But as countries engage in climate mitigation, it leads to losses, unfortunately. So traditional industries such as your fossil fuel industry, as we transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, that means jobs in the fossil fuel industry will be lost. But on the other hand, you can see jobs being created now in the renewable energy industry. So a just transition basically means that as we move from job losses to job creation, that we don't necessarily lead to any sort of inequities or inequality in terms of that transition. You don't want to leave anyone behind. You want to see jobs being created, but as well as decent work for all of our citizens in the economy. And I think what we're going to be focusing on in the Caribbean allows us to focus on that just transition because most Caribbean countries need to focus on climate change adaptation. And the good thing about climate change adaptation is that it leads to job creation. So one of the things you mentioned just now, just giving you an illustration, is transition to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles is just one of the numerous opportunities that we have in terms of public transport. But you can even have more persons utilizing public transport. That is actually a climate change adaptation measure as well. But as more persons use electric vehicles, that creates employment opportunities for persons working on electric vehicles. The batteries from the electric vehicles can be repurposed and recycled to store energy for households and businesses, and persons need to work on that industry in terms of storing electricity. So that just transition is essentially about creating decent work for all citizens as the economy transitions to a low carbon economy.
We brought into the conversation now climate change, climate adaptation, and mitigation, which was always a priority even prior to the pandemic. But now we have the additional pressures and disruption that were introduced by the COVID-19 pandemic. So in a case like that, where again, multiple crises we have to deal with, how do we integrate the just transition with COVID-19 recovery for the Caribbean?
Oh, excellent. So remember I mentioned we still need to focus on growth. And the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery from COVID-19 pandemic provides us a really great opportunity to focus on a sustainable recovery. And one of the things you want to do to stimulate the economy after a recession is that you want to invest more. And there are three types of investment that I would recommend that would support this just transition, as well as support green growth. One would be green investments. Green investments lead to what I call a double dividend. So it leads to greater economic activity while also reducing the environmental impact. And I'll give you an illustration of green investments that we can consider. One of the things that we've invested in Barbados is in electric vehicles. And also the Public Transport Board has also invested in green buses. What that does for the Transport Board is that it allows them to run a more efficient fleet and generate more profits from their activities, but it also reduces the environmental footprint of public transport in Barbados as well. Investing in wind farms and solar farms, those types of activities reduce your use of fossil fuels, but they can also generate energy at a really low cost. Wind farms are a really great example of this. Wind farms, if it is located in the right location, it can generate energy at a lower cost than any fossil fuel turbine that we have. And Caribbean economies are really well placed to utilize wind energy, even offshore wind energy, which might be a little bit more technically complex, but there are lots of opportunities there. The second thing is to invest in people. We've all seen the benefits of numerous societies around the world that have benefited from investing in people. If we can enhance the quality of our primary and public schools, we will see a better input coming into universities, and we can therefore see significant gains in terms of productivity of our workers and greater opportunities for workers as well. So I think there's a really great opportunity for us to invest more in our people. And then thirdly, we need to do a lot more research and development spending, both public sector or public R&D, but also private sector R&D as well. And the reason why I say this is you only generate new things or new products, new services if you engage in research and development. But unfortunately, the Caribbean has one of the lowest rates of research and development around the world. Most of us just spend 1% of GDP or less on research and development, and you're not going to generate the new industries, the new products, the new services when you are not investing in research and development, or you're not spending on research and development. So those are the three areas that I would like us to focus on. I've already mentioned already investment in adaptation. I think that one is a given. We don't have a choice in the Caribbean. We have to spend on adaptation measures. Ideally, because we haven't caused the climate change, or we haven't caused the damage that we're going to face as a result of climate change. That investment in adaptation should be financed by richer, more developed countries who have from basically polluting the planet. And they should be responsible for contributing to an adaptation fund. But Caribbean economies really don't have a choice. We have to spend on investment in adaptation. But the good thing about spending on adaptation, it reduces the vulnerability of the economies, it reduces risk, and it also provides opportunities for growth and development. And there are three key areas of adaptation that I think are really important. One, food security. Two, health and healthcare spending. And three, renewable energy.
The strategy in terms of post-COVID recovery has been to invest, but we need to ensure that that investment is aligned with, green, resilient, sustainable growth. How do you think the region should be leveraging the COVID-19 recovery initiatives where we are allocating resources? How should we leverage that to boost our green economies?
So I think we need to look at embedding green concepts in not almost, in everything that we do. So housing, how do we green our housing? So for example, the way in which we construct our housing to make it net, we make sure that we utilize as little energy as possible within that household. So utilizing PVs, utilizing solar water heaters, even the way in which or the type of windows we install and the orientation of the house so that we use a lot more natural wind cooling rather than AC cooling. All of those things help in relation to greening our housing stock and households in general. Greening our businesses as well. Just at a general level, we spend a lot of money on energy in many businesses as well. So how can we utilize various types of renewable energy sources in these businesses? So our farms, for example, they should be utilizing a lot more biogas, because a lot of the waste from farms can be used to produce biogas. So helping those farmers to invest more in biogas that can then be used in other parts of the economy would be quite useful. A lot of businesses in Barbados have now started utilizing PV systems on top of their roofs. Even thinking about how we plan our businesses as well, our planned business districts is a way of greening the economy. Because if you have your economic activity spread out across the country, that means that the persons that work at those businesses might need to engage in really long commutes across the breadth of the island or the country. But if you have business districts, you can then engage in maybe hub and spoke type public transport. So everyone goes into the city using public transport, or they can then jump on to another public transport option to get to one of these spokes within the network as well. So better planning is also a really great green investment option for countries as well. I spoke about housing, transport, just businesses in general. And the other area as well too, I haven't touched on in any significant way, is food security. I think this one came into focus during the COVID-19 pandemic when global supply chains were significantly disrupted. And, things that shouldn't have been a challenge for countries was a challenge. So simply getting, for example, vegetables became a challenge, which is quite unfortunate because traditionally Caribbean economies used to be fairly self-sufficient in at least producing vegetables and basic food crops. But as we've engaged in more service type economic activity, we've sort of moved away from that type of basic investment in agriculture. But I think we need to utilize a lot more technology in agriculture to make sure that we still maintain some level of food security. There still is a place for agriculture in Caribbean economies, but we have to make sure that we utilize technology if we are going to build back better in relation to agriculture. It can't simply be the traditional way of farming, because if we're going to engage in that traditional way of farming, we're quickly going to find that it's going to be cheaper to simply import the agricultural produce. But if we start utilizing the technology that is available to help our farmers produce goods at a cheaper price, then it can really help them build back better. The other thing in relation to building back better is our healthcare infrastructure and our healthcare system. One of the things that the University of the West Indies did during the COVID-19 pandemic is that we helped Caribbean economies to monitor the COVID-19 pandemic by, capturing the data and sharing the data in real time with policymakers so that they can monitor outbreaks and put policies in place as soon as possible. So that data component was really important. So health information and health data is a fundamental part of building back better within the Caribbean as well. The University of West Indies has the skills, has the individuals that can support building back better and helping Caribbean economies develop their health information networks. But we need to invest more in these areas. And then I'm going to touch on another issue that I've done a fair bit of research on as well in recent times, and that's the issue of sugar sweetened beverages and the link to NCDs. NCDs is a fundamental problem in the Caribbean. We spend a lot of money treating persons after the fact. And so there's nothing wrong with consuming a sugar sweetened beverage. In fact, juices, natural fruit juices having sugar. But what we don't want is for persons to utilize too much of these sugar sweetened beverages. So it's in our best interest to make sure that we work on the consumption patterns of citizens within the Caribbean, work on the consumption of sugar sweetened beverages, ensure that we minimize that as much as possible, work on the consumption of excess salt intake as well. These things in relation to health are fundamentally linked to sustainable development, because once you lose that individual, once that individual is no longer able to work, you lose that individual's skill, that individual's knowledge, all of the experience that he or she would have acquired over a lifetime of working is no longer available to the country and to that individual's firm. So it's a tremendous loss to the economy. So we really need to continue to focus on health of citizens within the Caribbean.
So as we wrap up, Professor Moore, I want to ask you, what is your biggest takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic?
Um, I think one of the biggest takeaways from this pandemic is how integrated the world is. I think you started with this as well. Economists have been saying for a long time that there's no going back from globalization. Globalization is here to stay. You can't just exclude yourself from the world economy and hope to survive. Like it or not, small and developing states are part of the world economy, and globalization is here to stay. And we have to, ensure that we understand the potential impacts of globalization and the implications for our economies, and minimize the negatives, but exploit potential benefits that could arise from globalization. My background as an economist in terms of my research, I guess, is a little bit diverse. But one of the great things that we have within the Caribbean is our natural resources. Scientists come to the Caribbean to investigate some of the trees, the plants, the animals that we have in the Caribbean to see what are the potential medicinal benefits of these plants and fauna. We haven't even exploited maybe 10, 20% of all of the potential that is there. So definitely our natural resources are key to our survival going forward. And we have to ensure that we protect it. And our oceans are part of that as well. All Caribbean islands have more area offshore than they have in terms of land mass. So protecting our oceans and protecting the Caribbean Sea is an important part of building back better and going forward as well. And then secondly, responding early was a key learning experience for most Caribbean countries. Those Caribbean countries that responded early to the health challenge by putting in place health monitoring systems, by putting in place vaccination schemes, and also putting in place economic policies to minimize the economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic, would have done a lot better during this period. In addition to that, having good fundamentals before a crisis is always good. So that policy recommendation never changes. It is always in the best interest of any country to maintain good economic fundamentals, because you never know when a crisis is going to hit. And then thirdly, just working on the issue of sustainability is something that, persons working in the area of the environment keep pushing. Sometimes it seems like if you're pushing against a movable object, because even though you tell persons that invest in the environment has this double dividend for your country, for the region, we still don't see as much investment in environmental goods and services as we should. Investing in food security leads to that double dividend. Investing in our healthcare infrastructure leads to a double dividend as well. And investing in renewable energy and other technologies like that lead to a double dividend.
If you had to choose one recommendation that you would like the region to focus on, if we are to really optimize the benefits of our post-COVID recovery measures, and also to accelerate the just transition of the workforce so that we can achieve sustainable development for our region, what would you say?
That's a tough one. With anything, there's always so much need. So it's hard to pinpoint just one area. But I think if we could maybe focus a bit more in the area of our energy, it might lead to some significant gains. Most Caribbean economies spend like 1/5 of their foreign exchange on energy imports. So weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels will not only lead to economic activity locally, because we're going to be producing more local energy from renewable energy sources, but it would also reduce our use of foreign exchange as well. And that foreign exchange, it is an important input into economic activity, because we can then maybe use that foreign exchange to maybe invest in other areas of the economy as well. So if there is one, I would probably focus on renewable energy, but I think my top three would be, and so I'm going to probably stick with three rather than one, food security, health, and renewable energy.
Thank you so much for listening to the Better Than Before series. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. For more info, or if you'd like to share your questions and ideas directly with us, please connect with Canary and the Climate Conscious Podcast on any of our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my personal favorite, LinkedIn. See show notes for direct links to our websites. The Better Than Before series is a production of the Climate Conscious Podcast in collaboration with Canary, funded by the Open Society Foundations. This series is edited and produced by Bradford Media, with artwork by Carrie Lee Dixon. Join us on the next episode.